Hello, you beautiful people. My name is Cameron, and welcome to the latest episode of Games Up podcast. Now, usually, as we say every week, I would be joined by Lewis, my partner in crime for this show, but last week he was ill, and this week illness continues, so wish him the best if you have him on social feeds, and I'm afraid you'll have to put up with me for just another week. And I'm going to start a bit unorthodoxly by reminding you, politely I hope, that if you like the show or you like anything you hear on it, we're on social channels at Games Upcast on everything, so Facebook, Twitter, all that jazz. And that if you like anything that you hear in this episode or any episode previously, please subscribe to the show. We've seen a fair amount of good growth over the last week or last kind of month on Facebook, and it'd be really nice to get a few more people subscribed to the show so that we know that people are actually enjoying what we put out. Now, usually we would start the show with an indie game of the week and the news of the week. But there's only one piece of news that any real geek is concerned with this week, and that is that just a few brief days ago, we treated our eye holes to the latest in the Star Wars saga. So we thought, let's not beat around the bush, let's get straight to the feature, and in this bite-sized version of Games Up podcast, let's talk about 5 Star Wars games that we need right now. And we're going to start with number 5, a Battlefront and Battlefront 2 remaster. Now, if you're young, you might be thinking, Battlefront? But they only came out recently. But no. Star Wars Battlefront has been around for quite a while, and there's a decent argument to be made that some of its best games were in its earlier years, nearly a decade ago. At the time of their original release, Star Wars Battlefront 1 and 2 were some of the best strategy sci-fi shooters on the market. Their mechanics were tight, their shooting gameplay was excellent, their board game style narrative was truly different, and they had some of the most satisfying Star Wars shooting you could ever find, especially in the jump from 1 to 2. The amount of refinement that happened was top-notch. Now, the shooting gameplay is still pretty good these days in Star Wars Battlefront, and certainly much better in Battlefront 2 than in Battlefront 1, but EA has not exactly had the smoothest of roads with its foray into the shooting Star Wars game arena, and a good way to get a bit of that goodwill back from players might be to recognise how good those original games were and release them back in a slightly remastered form so that people can play them to their heart's content. I would love this, I would pick this up in a second, and I think I'd probably be a little bit more lenient on the new games if I could still get my hands on those old ones. You can still pick them up on PC platforms, for example, but a lot of the time they don't work, or they don't work as perfectly as they once did, and it's a bit of a hampered experience. So, it seems like a bit of a cop-out, but a remaster of one of the best Star Wars games ever released, or even a set of them, could definitely be a good thing, and people would absolutely pick it up. Number 4, The Last Jedi. Don't worry, there are no spoilers here, we wouldn't do that to you. A couple of years ago, The Force Awakens released, and with it came a tie-in video game, Star Wars The Force Awakens Lego. Now, obviously, it's not a one-to-one tie-in, there's a slight difference, but the game was really well received. People were surprised at how well the cover shooting mechanics worked in a Lego game, and people were happy to see the return of Lego Star Wars. But, and again, without spoilers, The Last Jedi couldn't really work as a Lego game. It just doesn't fit the tone. Star Wars The Force Awakens worked as a Lego game because it harkened back to so many Star Wars films of old. The Last Jedi doesn't really do that. I think it's about time we see the return of a proper tie-in video game. A proper third-person or first-person action game that really takes you through the story or alongside the story of Star Wars The Last Jedi. There's some stuff that happens in the film that could definitely be expanded upon in a video game and maybe even added to significantly in a video game. It's obviously not going to happen as the movie released 5 days ago, and unless anyone's willing to do the "and it's out right now" moment, there doesn't seem to be any hint of a Last Jedi video game. But it might be worth considering for the future, and it certainly would be nice to think of as a hypothetical, even if we're not really getting it. Number 3. For number 3, we have to look to a different franchise entirely, Mass Effect. So you might think of Mass Effect as Mass Effect Andromeda, which came out this year to a pretty disappointing flat response. People were expecting a brand new trilogy of Mass Effect games with their giant space opera style gameplay and their incredible graphic fidelity and wonderful story, and it just kind of didn't happen. The story fell flat, the voice acting fell flat, some of the graphics fell flat, the game was glitchy, It just didn't have the response that people wanted it to. But Mass Effect is probably the closest thing you can draw to the equivalent of video game Star Wars. Its huge scale of a galaxy that is incredibly uniquely imagined and beautifully rendered is genuinely something to behold. If you haven't played a Mass Effect game before, you definitely should. It's the closest equivalent to Star Wars without the Star Wars name on it. It feels like there is an entire galaxy at your fingertips, and like the more you explore, the more beautiful, unique things you will find. There's very few video games that feel like it, which leads me to ask why we haven't just seen the Mass Effect equivalent of Star Wars. Give me a brand new story, give me a brand new independent story, and let me go off and explore those planets. Let me land down on Naboo for a couple of hours of story just to take it in again. Let me explore the diverse range of planets and cities and races and life and the dynamics between them. One of the best things about Mass Effect is there's an incredible sense of excitement every time you get to explore a new world. And personally, I feel it's criminal that we don't have the equivalent for Star Wars. There are some stunning Star Wars story games out there, don't get me wrong, but none quite on the scale of Mass Effect. So I don't know what to call it, I don't know where it would fit in with the franchise, and I don't even know it needs to be that strongly aligned. But I think just saying Mass Effect Star Wars summarises something that we definitely need, and we definitely love. Number 2. You're probably getting sick of hearing them on Games Upcasts, but Telltale. Telltale, Telltale, Telltale. They know how to take an established franchise, switch up the character dynamics, switch up the backstories, and make you really, really think about the person you want to be in these games and the decisions you want to make. If you doubt me, go and look at their Borderlands games, go and look at their Game of Thrones games, but most of all, look at Batman. Their series of Batman games is absolutely stunning because of the way they're willing to fuck with what you know as the accepted canon of Batman. I'd love them to do the same with Star Wars. Absolutely love them to do the same with Star Wars. Imagine if you had to pause a Telltale game to consider which of two characters you're going to cut down at the end of a lightsaber duel because they're so perfectly built up and tensely imagined. Personally, I would love to see Telltale go back and revisit the prequels. Now, a bunch of people have probably groaned, rolled their eyes and turned off at this point, but hear me out. The prequels had the possibility to give a really interesting and unique dynamic to the Star Wars story, but they kind of fell under the weight of their own badly imagined characters, badly written characters sometimes, and terrible CGI. If we took the unique story they could have added away from all those more negative aspects and put it into a video game so that you could play through that story and make the decisions yourself and build up the character of Vader before he became Vader, that could be a genuinely fascinating thing to experience. Nobody really likes Anakin in the prequels. He doesn't like sand, it's coarse and it gets everywhere. But it might be fascinating to play as Anakin, make the same decisions that you saw him make in the films, and really get an understanding of how tragic his character could be if it was written properly. All of this is hypothetical. There's nothing to say that a Telltale series of the prequels could actually be any good. But I think it makes a lot of sense, and obviously we're never going to get it, but I would love it. And finally, and don't get me wrong, there are so many other Star Wars games that we need right now. A remaster or a sequel to Jedi Power Battles from the original PlayStation. A new version of Star Wars Demolition that's kind of in the style of Rocket League would be amazing. A Battle Royale game set on Hoth where you're having to fight in teams would be stunning. There are so many Star Wars games that would make perfect sense right now, especially in the wake of something as important as The Last Jedi. But the one game, the top of the list, is the cancelled Darth Maul game. If you don't know about this game, the information is out there on the internet and fairly easy to find. I would recommend looking at Unseen 64. That's headed up by a guy called Liam who does amazing work at keeping an archive of video games that never got made and giving us a glimpse behind the scenes of how games are made, the kind of business decisions and deals they go through, and what eventually stops them from coming out to market. And one of these games is a Darth Maul game. It was pitched, I believe, about 7-ish years ago, and it's a third-person action game set after Episode 1 that explains what Maul did next. Now, if you only watch the films, that's going to be a bit confusing because he was cut in half, but he kind of lived on in Star Wars, and this game would have been a perfect way to experience it. Why do we need this game? Well, because we need more single-player stories. The recent Bethesda campaign has gone to prove this, and single-player stories are never a bad thing. But I also think we need better single-player action-adventure games. We've recently lost an action-adventure Star Wars game in the recent decisions that EA have made, and it would be awesome to get a truly different action-adventure game out of Star Wars. Darth Maul would have been that. It would have been darker, it would have been more focused on lightsaber combat rather than shooting, which is something that a lot of games focus on because shooting is probably easier to sell than sword combat effectively, which lightsaber is. But also it would have explored this dark, threatening character that Maul was, which is one of the best things to come out of the prequels. So it might not seem the most obvious answer, but I think the cancelled Darth Maul game is absolutely the Star Wars game that we need right now. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was a bite-sized version of Games Up. More of a feature, I guess, than a podcast, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. Sorry for the shameless plugs, but again, if you like what you heard here, please consider liking or subscribing to the show. It really does help us get out in front of a few more people, regardless of if you're on YouTube or iTunes. We publish on YouTube at 6:30 p.m. every Monday, and much, much earlier that day on iTunes, so you can catch it on your way to work, or not on your way to work if you're on your Christmas break, which I am. Hooray! We're also on Facebook and Twitter at Games Upcast, and we'd love you to come and join us on either of those so that you can see the news we post, the discussions that we have, some of the behind-the-scenes stuff that we do, and get a glimpse into what we do with Games Up. Thanks very much for listening. We'll see you next week as we get closer and closer to 2018 and Game of the Year episodes, but until then, the game's up.